I want to give a big thank you to all my patrons, and I'll be doing a Kingsguard roll call after today's video. Welcome back to the Fantasy Network, everyone. My name is, of course, Jimmy Nuts, and today we're going to be doing a no-spoiler review for a beloved book that is a part of a bigger series that is not finished yet, but that's okay, and that is The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is one of the few extraordinarily popular fantasy books that I have not covered here on the channel as of yet, or at least read in my own personal time. And there's a lot of hype around this. I was in a bit of a slump, so I went for a heavy hitter. And I gotta say, everything that people have told me about this book, it ranges from hilarious to beautiful writing to one of the best friendships between Jean and Locke in fantasy. And honestly, I felt like all of those statements were true, especially when it came to the friendship. I felt that very much so. It reminded me of me and my good friend Bobby B back here.
I swear by the seven, I'll bury you where you sit.
I know you love me, Bobby, don't lie. But let's talk about The Lies of Locke Lamora, what it's about, and how I found it. So if you are not familiar with Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, this is a book one of a much larger series, but a lot of people will say this, and I agree, that this could be read as a standalone. I have not read book 2, 3, and whatever else is out there, but I do know that when I got done with this, I felt very satisfied. I'd like to dive in, and I'll tell you why in just a few moments, but this is about Locke Lamora, an orphan boy who gets sent off, kind of sold off even, and finds himself with a found family of other orphans, and even has the good old-fashioned mentor trope. But the mentor trope here is not so much Gandalf. It's a lot darker than that, and in my opinion, also a lot more humorous. The humor in this book, it does shine through in those dynamics, so even though it is very sad, these kids are orphans, I still think that there's enough light material in here to make you giggle and to kind of even out what this book carries as a narrative, which does have moments that are extraordinarily hard-hitting, very impactful, and very emotional. This is a really well-balanced book, in my opinion. The orphans are a part of a group called the Gentlemen Bastards, which is a thieving guild. They go out and they steal from the rich, and you know, it's something that hooks you right from the get-go. The world building is sprinkled in. There is some long exposition, but it's a lot more Le Guin than it is Tolkien in that manner, where it's kind of mentioned in passing, and there's a lot of gaps that your brain is going to have to fill in, which I personally am a big fan of. Another thing that I feel pretty confident saying is I feel like Scott Lynch does the Le Guin way of writing fantasy, and it's actually pretty evident even in the title of the book, The Lies of Locke Lamora. This is alliteration, and in some literary circles, they will say that alliteration should be avoided. It is hokey, it is cheesy. I do not believe that. And in Steering the Craft book, Le Guin talks about how, you know, fantastical worlds need fantastical writing, and that you should be stylized, and that you should reach for these tools and use them appropriately. Like anything, if you overuse it, it's not going to be a good thing. But I think Scott Lynch balances beautifully in between his really, really witty dialogue and his ridiculously fun to read action scenes. He has these times of exposition or transition periods in the text that are assisted by alliteration that make them a lot easier to swallow and get your mind working in a way that maybe it wasn't going to be working in general, like as a default. I found myself in this book looking at situations in a more metaphorical sense. There's a lot of as-ifs and a lot of likes in his writing, and I'm going to read a couple passages here that kind of stuck out to me. But with that, you end up thinking about maybe even a trivial everyday task in a whole different light and comparing it to something that has, it's almost absurd how he compares things. It's not all just sharp tongue jabs at one another or absurd comparisons or anything. There's actually some really good heavy hitting lines in here as well. The one I really, really liked is the act of enslavement itself was winked at if there was no one left to speak for the victim. I'll read that again. The act of enslavement itself was winked at if there was no one left to speak for the victim. It's pretty heavy, and that's like in the first quarter of the book, and I knew immediately that Scott Lynch, whether or not the story would be the biggest hit for me, I knew that his writing was going to be a big hit for me, using a lot of alliteration, a very visual way of writing. His imagery is extremely well done, and this world in Camor is awesome. And as I said, I am a big fan of alliteration. I think that it can provide an attachment and almost like a rhythm to the writing. I hesitate to use rhythm because we're not writing music or poetry or lyrics or whatever, but it just gives it this flow feeling to me, at least in my brain. And he does more than just following consonants of the same type over and over and over again. Like The Lies of Locke Lamora is a very obvious example here, but if you look at book 2, even in its title, he's kind of showing you things that he'll do. So red sea under red skies. So he will actually have 2 forms of alliteration, or I should say 2 examples of alliteration going down through a paragraph. And as the reader, if you are close reading a paragraph and trying to figure out exactly what he's trying to accomplish, it is a lot of fun to like kind of follow these almost schemes and these pairs. And then when you look at the paragraph as a whole, you're just like, man, that was a blast to read, at least for me. This is an example of some of his alliteration that I really enjoyed. He screamed again, reflexively, and spat blood. His view of the sky spun, first left then right, as though the world were trying on strange new angles for his approval. So the world is shaking, and it's as if the world is checking out different angles to see if he approves. You know, whenever you're trying on some clothes and you hit the pose, you know, how's this look? Is this my good side? Is this my bad side? I don't have a good side. But nonetheless, this is a really good example of how I said he does these comparisons of 2 things that are usually not related, or a different way of thinking about just a general circumstance, which here is obviously he's being rocked left and right. Very cool, but also the alliteration in here. You can just kind of follow the rhythm of the words. You know, you have screamed, spat, sky, spun, strange. So playing with different ways of getting out that S sound. And maybe I'm going way too deep in it, and it might also be the fact that I'm a big rap fan and I enjoy rhyme schemes and everything else. That's not exactly what he's doing here, but he is playing with a certain kind of rhythm almost. And I really, really loved his writing. So even though I would say The Lies of Locke Lamora, this isn't like one of my all-time favorite stories. I don't know if this would make a top 10 list for me as a book, but Scott Lynch's writing is something that I am very much enjoying and I am attached to. And I feel like most authors get better as they go. So what is book 2, 3, and if he continues the series, 4, 5, 6, 7 going to look like? As an author that I'm already meshing with so much, that is very, very encouraging. And if you're a big fan of alliteration or seeing how authors play with words, I think Scott Lynch could be a big home run for you. While he's using this beautiful writing, he's also kind of relaying the setting that he set out so beautifully with what the characters are experiencing as people within whatever conflict they're in. So at the end of chapter 2, and this isn't a spoiler, but Donna is so surprised that these people are being eaten alive by sharks and they're being tricked. And she's like, I can't believe they're being tricked. All the while she's sitting there being fooled as well. She is what she is seeing and what she is looking down upon and is flabbergasted by this fact while she's also experiencing. So this is a very on the nose way of kind of relaying this to the reader, but that is The Lies of Locke Lamora. Its subtlety is more so in its world building. When it attacks certain themes or certain situations, it's going to be a lot more on the nose than something that maybe has a more philosophical tone. And I mentioned how I felt like a lot of the different elements in this book were balanced, but it's also the way that the interludes are balanced with the main narrative. So you are flashing back to kind of figure out how Locke and Jean became friends, but also just how they got to where they are in The Gentlemen Bastards. And usually that can be a pretty hard thing to do. Jumping back in time can really kill momentum in a book, but I felt like this book, at least for the first half of it, did a great job of balancing the flashbacks with the present narrative. I would get so caught up in the present day narrative that I would be like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? It ends on like a cliffhanger, like a TV episode cliffhanger almost. And then you jump back in time and you go, man, like I want to see what happens next. But Scott Lynch does a really good job of then balancing that interlude with also a cliffhanger. Even though we kind of know where it ends up, there are minor events that happen in these interludes that end up being big for the characters. So by the time you're done with the interlude, you're like, oh no, I just want to continue the interlude. Forget the main story. And then we're back in the main story. I thought he ping-ponged this really, really well until about the 60 to 75% mark. And that is where I started finding the past way less interesting. And that's because there are some major twists and turns in this book. It is very chaotic at a point, and I think that that's intentional. In that way, it kind of reminds me of Perdido Street Station. My friend Zan pointed this out, and ever since he pointed it out, I can't unsee it. They are alike in that sense that it's just kind of a wild, maybe you could use the word messy plot. I don't know if I want to use that word here, but there's certainly a lot of randomness and a lot of chaos. It's hectic. And that's what makes the present day a lot more fun to me than the back half interludes of Lies of Locke Lamora. And that's where my gripes kind of come in with this book just a little bit. In the back half, I didn't find myself having as much fun. And there is a little bit of repetitive nature, even though things will change or people will mess up, which is really fun. And it just went on a little bit long for me, but that's just my subjective opinion, especially with some of the back half interludes I wasn't as interested in. I also found that the proper climax towards the end of the book did not exceed some of the crazy stuff that happened earlier in the book. So while I think the climax was fun, I don't know if the way it was executed made as much sense as it should have. And I definitely felt like there were moments earlier in the book, especially like I think it was about a third of the way through, that really kind of blew my mind. And I almost expected to be walked back, and it wasn't. So I don't know. I just felt like it was a bit of an uneven experience. We go up the roller coaster, and I expected, maybe a dip, and then back up. But it was more like here, and then we went down, and we had a couple micro hills. And I never reached what I got in the first half of the book. But that is my subjective experience. One thing I can say that was cool as this book went on is that our protagonists and Gentlemen Bastards, they fail. They fail, and it is fun to watch and heartbreaking at times. But with them failing, you avoid something that I absolutely hate in my fantasy, and that is the too cool for school, especially when it comes to thieves, right? Or someone that's supposed to be cunning, or even like an assassin type. I bounce off that really, really hard whenever they're a little too cool for school. As my friend Alan from Library of Alexandria would say, a leaner, right? Too cool, just kind of leaning back. I do bounce off that. Sometimes it can be done well, so I never say anything's just purely bad. But this book could have fell into that trap relatively easily. But I think Scott Lynch took a lot of care to make these flawed characters, give them a very sympathetic background, and to watch the relationship build through the interludes went a long way to make them feel relatable instead of just a spectacle. And that's what I would say is my favorite part of the characters in The Lies of Locke Lamora. So even though the back half of the book wasn't as good for me as the first half, I gotta say, I thought that the character arcs were excellent, and I am excited to see where this goes. So I do just want to confirm, this is fun. Jean and Locke, which I like Jean just a little bit more than Locke, by the way. I don't know if that's a hot take or not. But, this does have some really fun characters that I think you could have an attachment to. It is funny, at least for my humor taste. And there are some impactful moments in here, and the action is written very well. There's nothing about Scott Lynch's writing that I say, oh, there's a big glaring weakness. This is just solid. And from a style perspective, lands so much with me as a reader. I like to feel mesmerized when I'm reading, and that alliteration does that for me. And the fact that he plays with different sounds in his alliteration throughout the paragraph really makes that exposition a little bit easier to swallow. And Comor, is a really cool world. This even has an endorsement from George R. R. Martin, which we always know he puts fantasy as it ought to be written. That's the meme. He wrote like a solid paragraph with details about the world. So George R. R. Martin legit loved this book, and he's my favorite author, so that's kind of cool. So I do recommend this. Don't worry about it being unfinished. I think you could read this and see it as a standalone and put it down. I can confirm. I think that is true, at least in my experience. Did you like The Lies of Locke Lamora when you read it? Are you going to be reading it in the future? Let me know down in the comments below if you have some favorite quotes or passages, because there are a lot, some really amazing dialogue in this book. I would love to see you put it down in the comments below. If you like this video, go ahead and hit like. If you dislike, you can hit dislike. If you love to think about subscribing, I do all types of bookish content here on the channel, and I would love to have you. There's a Patreon in the description. It's optional, but always appreciated. And until I see you next time, be good, be safe, and remember to always keep turning the page. Or else. I want to give a big shout out to all my patrons, especially my Kingsguard, which include Lauren, Henrik, Kai, Simon, Oscar, Stewart, Stephen R., Ikaika, Amanda, RJ Shaw, Nicoletta Tanner, Jennifer, Garrick, Frank, Evie, Fever, Jay, Sarah, Pat, Kevin, Ryan, Michael, Terrence, Wade, Darren, Taylor D., Derry, John C., Bass, Mitch, Sebastian, Benjamin, Jobot, Noel, Amanda L., Kyle C. Scott, and Steve Talks Books. Thank you all so much. You're the best.